Leave a physical apple on a table, and biology dictates it eventually shrivels and decays. The physical world is bound by material degradation. Classical social theory analyzed this physical world. Modernity was understood through the lens of material production. Thinkers historically measured society by its mode of production, how physical labor transformed raw materials into goods with practical physical use value. But human societies have not always operated under capitalist production. Early pre-modern cultures relied on entirely different mechanisms. They organized themselves around symbolic exchange, ritual, and the prestige of gift-giving, where meaning was untethered from industrial efficiency. In the 1960s, a French sociologist named Jean Baudrillard began investigating how these concepts intersected with modern consumerism. Baudrillard began his career grounded firmly in Marxist political economy, attempting to critique capitalist production. Yet, the economic landscape of the mid-20th century was mutating. The era of competitive market capitalism had given way to monopoly capitalism. Accelerated manufacturing techniques had largely solved the problem of scarcity, forcing corporations to shift their primary focus to demand management, manufacturing the desire to consume. Traditional Marxist theory proved inadequate for this new environment. A theoretical framework built to dissect the exploitation of physical factory labor could not decode a society increasingly driven by advertising, media, and psychological persuasion. Understanding contemporary society required a clean break from these older models. For Baudrillard, the focus of critical thought had to shift away from factory floors and toward the new, complex codes of consumption. He defined this new economic reality as the regime of sign value. Human consumption was no longer driven by utility. Instead, individuals purchased prestige and status. The rapid proliferation of advertising altered the commodity. The primary product was the social code it represented. This framework drew heavily on structuralist linguistics, a discipline championed by thinkers like Roland Barthes, who analyzed how cultural phenomena operate exactly like written language. In linguistics, a word possesses meaning only because of its position relative to other words. Baudrillard applied this to commodities. The material use value of an item is swallowed by an expanding web of sign value, a network of brands and trends that derive their meaning solely by contrasting with one another. This system traps the individual. Because identity is constructed through purchases, alienation becomes ubiquitous. The subject is forced to navigate a totally commodified society just to communicate who they are. This dynamic explains the failure of the radical student uprisings in France in May 1968. The consumer society does not suppress revolt through absolute force, it absorbs it. Rebellion itself is rapidly translated into a marketable aesthetic and sold back to the public. Humanity had officially exited the era of production. We had entered the era of simulation, an epoch where the code precedes and dictates the physical object. We now exist within an environment of absolute media saturation, where the sheer volume of signals fractures the traditional boundaries of reality. Baudrillard termed this structural collapse implosion. Previously autonomous realms of society, art, the economy, politics, and sexuality, lose their distinct boundaries and collapse into a single dense node of information. This creates a trans-aesthetic and trans-economic world. Because art is now integrated into advertising and economics is driven by political optics, standard criteria for judgment dissolve. When everything is aesthetic, nothing is. The psychological consequence of this saturation is what Baudrillard called the ecstasy of communication. Individuals are subjected to a continuous, frictionless flow of images and demands. Under this pressure, the human subject is completely stripped of sovereignty. The individual is no longer an active agent navigating a physical public sphere, but rather a passive screen, absorbing the influent networks penetrating everyday life. Modern psychology categorized alienation through pathologies like paranoia or hysteria, disorders rooted in hidden meanings and repressed depth. The contemporary condition, however, is characterized by a schizophrenic over-proximity to information, a state where everything is explicitly exposed and immediately present. The human subject is overwhelmed by the object world. Because the individual acts merely as a terminal for incoming codes, classical theories of political resistance and individual agency are rendered obsolete. To illustrate the mechanics of this simulation, Baudrillard utilized a fable by Jorge Luis Borges about an empire that drafts a map so impossibly detailed it covers the exact scale of the territory it represents. In classical modernity, the physical territory existed first, and the map was drawn to represent it. In postmodernity, the historical sequence is inverted. The map precedes the territory. The simulated model generates the physical reality. The real is powerless against the structural perfection of the simulation. Biological decay and physical constraints cannot compete with the execution of the code. This condition is hyperreality. The models, the images, and the codes have become more real and hold more structural authority than the reality they supposedly represent. Baudrillard applied simulation theory directly to late 20th century geopolitics. He posited that the global system had achieved a frozen history, locked into place by systemic deterrence. The Cold War's stalemate exemplifies this artificial, anorexic history. The mutually assured destruction of the nuclear buildup guaranteed that no actual, decisive historical event could occur, trapping both sides in a perpetual simulation of conflict. The hyperreal system utilizes oppositional elements to fortify itself. By absorbing the threat of communism, Western capitalism rationalized its own structure, improving its global technological and market order. When military conflict did break out, it was immediately processed as a hyperreal media spectacle, rather than a traditional war of territorial acquisition. This logic produced Baudrillard's highly controversial claim that the 1991 Gulf War did not take place. The conflict was executed through computerized aerial models, smart bomb camera feeds, and televised briefings. It was experienced globally as an operational simulation of war, entirely detached from the physical reality of ground combat. Whether charting economic markets or executing military strikes, the hyperreal model is self-replicating. It successfully absorbs all concrete, unpredictable reality into a managed virtual spectacle. Pushed to its logical endpoint, hyperreality produces an environment completely purged of human imperfection. Baudrillard termed this the perfect crime. It is the total destruction of reality, achieved by virtualizing away the dirt, the unpredictability, and the flaws of human existence. This total aestheticization of the world leaves us with a pristine, safe copy, yet it is a copy of a reality that never actually existed. This conclusion forces a direct confrontation with academic sociology. Traditional Marxist critiques, like those of Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, diagnosed the consumer society by arguing it alienated humans from their true needs. Those critiques hinge on the emancipatory hope that a true reality still exists beneath the capitalist system, waiting to be recovered. Baudrillard's metaphysical stance rejects this entirely. The system has moved beyond obscuring reality to a state of total eradication. In this universe of appearance, the pursuit of objective truth is an obsolete illusion. The simulation achieves absolute victory over the physical material. The organic is erased. The code remains. Facing this, Baudrillard proposed fatal strategies as the only remaining theoretical response. Humanity must abandon the philosophy of the subject. We must stop trying to master the world and instead surrender to the strategies and ruses of the object. He argued that there is an impossible exchange between theory and reality. The world is ultimately meaningless, and no conceptual framework or philosophical system can successfully capture it. However, the illusion of a frozen, uneventful history was shattered by a sudden, violent eruption of the real at the start of the 21st century. Baudrillard analyzed global terrorism as an antibody reacting against hyperreality. The September 11th attacks utilized the dominant global power's own aviation, media, and cybernetic rules to disrupt the system from within. It was a pure event. The highly calculated simulation momentarily collapsed beneath a massive, unmanageable excess of reality. Yet, the globalized system immediately attempts to reabsorb the event. The raw trauma is rapidly converted into endless media loops, security protocols, and political narratives, pulling the rupture back into the matrix of simulation. The object world has outmaneuvered human subjectivity. We are left only with traces of reality, forced to navigate the fatal destiny of our own flawless illusions.